There are moments that arrive without warning, wrapped inside something as ordinary as snow. This is one of those moments. And if you leave now, you will never know what really happened on that mountain, and why the truth stayed buried until today. Jack Mercer didn't go looking for a story that night. He was just trying to get home. But the blizzard had other plans. And so did a wounded military dog lying alone in the darkness, refusing to leave the side of an unconscious woman buried beneath the drifts, a woman someone very powerful wanted dead before morning. This is not simply a story about survival. This is not simply a story about courage. This is a story about loyalty. The kind that doesn't calculate risk. The kind that plants its feet in the frozen ground and says, "Not here. Not while I still breathe." A retired Navy SEAL. A wounded K-9. An FBI agent who knew too much. And a blizzard that swallowed them all while the hunters closed in. What Jack found in that storm didn't just change his life. It shook the mountains themselves. And by the time the rescue helicopters cut through the gray morning sky, everything had changed. Stay with me. This story earns every minute you give it. The morning Jack Mercer drove into town, the sky was the color of old pewter, flat, heavy, pressed against the peaks of the Cascade Range like a lid on a pot about to boil. He had lived in these mountains long enough to read that sky the way other men read newspapers. With quiet attention and a deep, private understanding that the world was about to say something important. He just hadn't figured out what yet. His truck was a dark green Ford F-250, dented along the passenger side from a run-in with a fallen pine 2 winters back that he had never bothered to repair, because out here nobody cared about dents. What they cared about was whether your tires were chained, whether your engine would turn over in 20 below, and whether you had enough firewood stacked along the south wall to last a week without a resupply. Jack had all three covered. He had learned early in life that preparation wasn't pessimism. It was intelligence wearing a practical coat. Ghost sat in the passenger seat the way he always did. Upright, ears slightly forward, amber eyes scanning the tree line as the truck rolled through the switchbacks above the valley floor. Ghost was a 4-year-old German shepherd, jet black with a ghost gray muzzle that had given him his name, and he was the closest thing to a partner Jack had in this new chapter of his life. Not a pet. That word felt wrong, diminishing, like calling a surgeon a knife holder. Ghost was a trained protection and tracking animal, and more than that, he was the most honest creature Jack had ever known. Dogs didn't perform loyalty. They either had it or they didn't. Ghost had it in his bones. Jack had served 14 years in the United States Navy, 11 of those as a SEAL. When he finally stepped away from the teams, he had done it without ceremony. No tearful goodbyes. He had simply come to the end of a thing, the way a river comes to the end of a canyon, and then spread himself out into something wider and quieter. The mountains of central Washington had been the answer to a question he hadn't known he was asking. He bought 38 acres of timber and ridgeland, built a cabin with his own hands over 2 summers, and began the long, unhurried process of learning how to be still. It was not easy. It had taken almost a year before he could sleep past 4 in the morning without sweeping a room he already knew was empty. It had taken longer before silence stopped feeling like a threat. But Ghost had helped with both of those things in ways that no therapist or medication had managed. The dog simply existed beside him, warm, present, entirely unconcerned with the past, and somewhere in that unconcerned presence Jack had found something he hadn't expected. Something like peace. He had been in town to pick up diesel, a propane refill, and 3 weeks of dry goods from the hardware supply on Boundary Road. The woman behind the counter had watched the Weather Channel all morning, and told him with the flat certainty of someone who had lived through 47 mountain winters that what was coming was not ordinary. A high-pressure system colliding with a moisture shelf rolling in off the Pacific. Possible accumulations of 3 to 4 feet in the higher elevations. Wind gusts that could close passes for days. Jack nodded, loaded the truck, and started home. He had supplies. He had wood. He had Ghost. He was not afraid of storms. He was 43 minutes from his cabin when the sky made its first serious statement. The snow that had been falling lightly all morning suddenly shifted character, the way a conversation shifts when someone stops being careful. The flakes thickened and multiplied, and the wind became a voice with intention. Within minutes the visibility on the mountain road dropped from a few hundred yards to almost nothing. Jack clicked his fog lights on, slowed to a crawl, and leaned forward with his hands firm at 10 and 2. He had driven this road in bad conditions before. The key was patience and memory, knowing the curves before they arrived, reading the shoulder by instinct when the painted lines disappeared. Ghost shifted in his seat. Not dramatically. Just a small adjustment of his weight, a slight lean toward the windshield. Jack noticed it without comment. The road climbed through long sweeping bends before cresting a ridge and dropping into the bowl of timber where his property began. The pines on either side were already bowed with fresh accumulation, and the world beyond them was white static, loud and featureless and total. Jack kept his eyes on the narrow strip of road ahead and let muscle memory do the work. It was Ghost who changed everything. The dog went rigid. Not the eager stiffening he got when he smelled deer in the timber. This was different. This was the particular stillness Ghost adopted when something was wrong. His ears pinned forward, his body became a single held breath, and a low sound began in his chest. Not quite a growl, not quite a whine, landing somewhere between them with the unmistakable quality of alarm. Jack brought the truck to a complete stop. He sat for a moment with the engine running and the wipers beating back snow, watching his dog. In 14 years of service he had learned that the fastest way to die was to ignore the things that didn't add up. Ghost didn't do things without reason. "What is it, boy?" Ghost turned and looked directly at Jack. Those amber eyes, always startlingly intelligent, held something close to urgency. Then the dog looked back out the passenger window, into the wall of snow and trees to the right of the road. Jack put the truck in park, pulled on his storm gloves, and stepped out into the blizzard. The cold was immediate and absolute. He pulled his balaclava up and squinted against the white. He opened Ghost's door and the dog leaped out, landing in deep snow, and moved immediately toward the tree line. Jack followed. They pushed through 30 yards of knee-deep drifts before reaching the first line of trees. The timber broke the wind somewhat but did nothing for the snow, which came down through the branches in curtains and clumps. Ghost moved with purpose, nose low, body angled into the terrain, and Jack stayed close enough to keep the black shape in sight. In these conditions, losing each other even briefly could become serious. Ghost stopped. Jack stopped. Then he heard it. A sound that did not belong to wind or trees. A sound that was organic and desperate and heartbreaking in its smallness against the vastness of the storm. A whimper. Low, pained, intermittent. The sound of an animal in genuine trouble. Jack moved forward until he could see what Ghost was already watching with careful, absolute attention. There, at the base of a massive old-growth Douglas fir, half covered by snow and pine debris, was a dog. Not Ghost's size. Larger. A Belgian Malinois. Jack recognized the breed immediately. Compact, muscular, built like a precision instrument. The dog lay on its side, and even from 5 feet away, he could see dark staining in the fur along its left flank. Blood, and not a small amount of it. The animal's breathing was rapid and shallow, its ribcage fluttering. But its eyes were open. And those eyes, even in pain, even in the diminishment of blood loss and cold, watched Jack with alertness that was at once beseeching and warning. "Don't come closer," those eyes said. "But please, help." In the same moment Jack saw what the Malinois was positioned in front of. A human being. Lying face up in the snow, arms at her sides, dressed in tactical field gear. The wind shifted the snow just enough for him to read the letters in bold yellow across the chest of her jacket. FBI. Jack's training took over with the clean efficiency of a switch being thrown. Unconscious female, approximate age late 30s. K9 protective. Visible injury indicators uncertain under snow coverage. Possible external threat unknown. He moved forward slowly, hands open and low, speaking in the calm register he had used around working dogs his entire adult life. "Easy, easy, buddy. I'm not a threat. I'm going to help her. The Malinois lifted its head, and the growl that came out was not theatrical. It was pure, experienced, professional. This was a trained law enforcement working dog telling Jack with complete seriousness that it would defend the woman behind it regardless of its own condition. Jack had enormous respect for that. He also knew exactly how to respond. He stopped, crouched, made himself smaller. Let Ghost come forward first, slowly, head low, body sideways. Non-threatening. Two working dogs reading each other. Jack waited. The Malinois watched Ghost for a long moment. Then it looked at Jack. The growl diminished by 1 degree. Jack reached into his coat pocket and found a strip of dried venison jerky. He held it out at arm's length, not toward the dog, just in the space between them. An offering. A signal. Not food exactly, but information. I am not an enemy. I have things to give, not take. The Malinois' nostrils flared. Its eyes moved between Jack and the jerky, and then, briefly, to the woman it was protecting. Then it laid its head back down on the snow, not sleeping, not surrendering, but shifting just that crucial fraction that said, proceed. Carefully. Jack moved to the woman's side. She was breathing. Barely, but breathing. Her lips carried a bluish cast, and her skin was waxy with cold. Her tactical gloves had probably saved her fingers, but her face had been exposed long enough that frostbite was an immediate concern. He checked her pulse at the carotid, weak, present, irregular. He found a wound at her right temple, dark and clotted, consistent with blunt impact trauma. She had hit something, or something had hit her. No exit wounds suggesting gunshot, though the blood on the K9's flank told a different story about what that dog had been through. She needed warmth. Right now. Or in 20 minutes nothing else would matter. Jack stood and assessed the terrain, the snow depth, the distance to the road. He was 6'2" and 220 pounds of muscle memory and operational experience. He had carried injured teammates out of situations that made this look like a hiking trail. He crouched, slid his arms beneath the woman with careful precision, protecting her spine, and stood. The Malinois scrambled to its feet instantly. The effort produced a visible tremor through its entire body. It stood anyway. It took one step, then another. Following. You're with me, Jack said, to the dogs, to the storm, to whatever was listening. All of you. Come on. Getting back to the truck was not simple. The snow had deepened and the wind had swung around to push directly into their faces. Jack carried the woman with her weight balanced across his shoulders, moving in a controlled crouch that kept her head protected. He counted steps because counting was focus and focus was survival. Ghost moved at his left flank. The Malinois, injured, bleeding, barely bearing weight on its left side, followed behind, and the sight of it broke something open in Jack's chest, because the dog never once stopped. Not once. He got them to the truck. He laid the woman carefully across the back seat, her head elevated on his rolled storm jacket. He lifted the Malinois into the cargo area with the controlled care he would use handling something irreplaceable, reading the dog's pain, moving with it rather than against it. Ghost jumped in beside the injured dog without being told, and the two animals arranged themselves in the immediate solidarity of creatures who recognize each other's nature. Jack got behind the wheel. His hands were shaking slightly, not from cold, from adrenaline. He breathed through it and put the truck in gear. The drive to his cabin took 34 minutes. He drove it in the same focused silence he had maintained in mountains on the other side of the world, thinking about firewood and warm water and the first aid kit under the bathroom sink. He did not yet let himself think about the fact that this woman's presence in the snow, with a military-grade K9 and what appeared to be an active operation underway, was not an accident of weather. This was not a woman who had gotten lost on a trail. When the cabin emerged from the white like something remembered rather than seen, he felt the particular relief of a place that is truly yours waiting exactly where you left it. The cabin held heat the way a good coat does, not by fighting the cold but by refusing to acknowledge it. He had the wood stove going within 4 minutes of getting inside, the propane heater following. He carried the FBI agent to the couch nearest the stove and began the methodical process of treating hypothermia the correct way. Gradual rewarming, dry clothing, insulated layers, warm fluids when consciousness allowed. He cut away her outer tactical jacket with his medical shears. She was dressed for serious fieldwork, high-quality gear, well-fitted. On her left wrist was a faded tattoo, 3 letters in block font. Her FBI badge was in the interior pocket of the jacket, and when he pulled it out and read it, his expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes did. Special Agent Emily R. Carter. Federal Bureau of Investigation. Counterintelligence Division. Counterintelligence. Not narcotics. Not kidnapping. Not conventional organized crime. Counterintelligence meant threats to national security. Foreign actors. Domestic extremist networks. Criminal enterprises with government-level resources. Whatever had brought her to this mountain in this storm, it was not small. He found the satellite communicator clipped to her belt, a military-grade iridium device, locked behind biometric and numeric sequences he couldn't bypass. He set it on the kitchen table. In her left thigh cargo pocket he found a sealed evidence drive in a waterproof hard case, its tamper-evident band intact. He set that beside the communicator. He stood in his kitchen and looked at these objects and thought carefully. Then he went to the dogs. The Malinois had allowed itself to be brought inside without resistance. It had settled on the braided rug in front of the fire, Ghost close beside it, and was lying with its head on its paws and its eyes half closed. In genuine pain but stable. Its breathing had already improved in the warmth. Jack got his trauma kit, not a standard hiker's first aid box but a serious field kit with suture material, hemostatic gauze, irrigation syringes, and a full complement of wound care supplies maintained with the same regularity as his other equipment, and crouched beside the Malinois. The dog allowed it. Not without tension, not without low vocalizations that communicated awareness of every movement Jack made. But it held still with the discipline of an animal whose training had become character. The wound in the flank was a graze, deep, ragged, consistent with a projectile. The bullet had not penetrated the body cavity, which was the most important single fact in Jack's assessment. Intact vital organs. Significant blood loss, significant pain, but the dog was going to live. He irrigated the wound, packed it with hemostatic gauze, sutured the deepest portion with interrupted stitches, and wrapped it in a compression bandage. The Malinois never snapped at him. It trembled. Its muscles contracted against the pain. But it held still in a way that told Jack everything about this animal's character. When he finished, he sat back on his heels and simply looked at the dog. "You did something extraordinary out there," he said quietly. The Malinois' tail moved once, slow, exhausted, entirely real. Jack went back to Emily Carter and checked her again. Color slightly better. Breathing steadier. He got warm broth from the stove and tried a small amount between her lips and was relieved when her throat moved in a swallow. Her body was fighting. He was reaching for his personal satellite phone to contact federal channels. He had contacts from his operational years that existed outside normal chains, when Ghost moved. The dog was on his feet instantly, crossing to the front window, his entire body in that locked and loaded stillness Jack had learned to respect at the cellular level. The hackles along Ghost's spine were raised. The sound in his chest was not curiosity. It was something with an edge. Jack crossed the room in 3 silent steps and stood to the side of the window, never in front of it, never silhouetted against light, and looked out. The Malinois had raised its head from the rug. Despite its wounds, despite the exhaustion and the pain, it was watching the door. Jack could see nothing through the window but snow. The storm had intensified since he'd come inside. Visibility down to 15 feet. Nothing his eyes could resolve. But Ghost was not wrong. He went to the hallway cabinet, the one that looked like a linen closet and was something else entirely, and unlocked it with the key he kept on his person at all times. He had not been naive, moving to this remoteness, about what that remoteness could mean in a world where certain kinds of trouble didn't stay in cities. He had prepared accordingly. He took what he needed and stood for a moment in the hallway with his back against the wall and his eyes on the front door. On the couch, Emily Carter made a sound. Not words. Just the sound of someone swimming up through layers of darkness towards something they couldn't quite reach. Jack moved to her side immediately and crouched, and her eyes opened. They were brown, dark and sharp, and even through the fog of whatever she was fighting, they found his face with a precision that told him she was more present than she appeared. Her lips moved. He leaned closer. "Don't." Her voice was barely there, scraped thin by cold. "Don't trust anyone. They're coming." "Who's coming?" Her eyes drifted, then found him again with visible effort. "Carter. Emily Carter. FBI." A pause, gathering something from deep inside. "The drive. Evidence drive. Don't let them." Her hand found his wrist with a grip surprisingly strong for someone who had been unconscious for an hour. "Someone inside betrayed us. They know where I am." "How do they know where you are?" Her eyes were already losing the battle with consciousness. But she managed one more thing before the darkness took her back. One more sentence that landed in the quiet cabin like a stone dropped into still water. "They're not stopping. For the storm." Then she was gone again. Her grip on his wrist loosened. Jack straightened slowly. He stood in the center of his cabin, fire burning, wounded agent on his couch, wounded K9 on his rug, his own dog at the window watching the storm like a sentry on a wall, and let the information arrange itself into the shape it was taking. He did not flinch from what that shape was. Someone had tried to kill Emily Carter on that mountain road. The dog had gotten her into the trees and stood over her body and refused to leave. The evidence drive on his kitchen table contained something important enough to kill for. And the people who had tried to kill her were still out there. In the storm. Moving toward his cabin. Ghost turned from the window and looked at Jack. In the dog's amber eyes was something that lived in the space between question and statement, the wordless communication that has existed between men and dogs across 10,000 years of shared darkness and shared danger. Jack looked back at his dog. "I know," he said quietly. He went back to the cabinet. He began to prepare. Outside, somewhere in the white and howling dark, engines were moving through the storm. And the blizzard that had seemed like a threat just hours ago had become something else entirely. The only thing standing between Emily Carter and the people who wanted her dead before morning. The snow kept falling. The fire kept burning. And Jack Mercer, who had once fought in the darkest corners of a world most people never saw, found himself precisely where his entire life had been quietly training him to stand. At the center of the storm. Ready. The cabinet in the hallway held what Jack needed and nothing more. A Sig Sauer P320 in a retention holster. 2 spare magazines. A suppressed Ruger in case silence mattered more than stopping power. Night vision monocular, Generation 3, military grade. 50 feet of high-tensile paracord in a stuff sack beside a small hardware bag, assembled over 2 winters for no reason he had ever articulated to himself until this moment. He pulled on his chest rig over his wool sweater, seated the P320, pocketed the spare magazines, and hung the night vision monocular around his neck. He took the paracord and the hardware bag. Then he stood in the hallway and listened. The wind came against the cabin in long sustained pressures. Between those pressures there were moments of relative quiet where other sounds lived, if you were still enough and trained enough to separate signal from noise. Jack closed his eyes and slowed his breathing, and opened his mind the way you open a hand rather than a fist. There. Beneath the wind. The low, unmistakable compression of diesel engines working hard against terrain. Not one engine. 2. Moving slowly, either the storm forcing caution or the drivers minimizing their acoustic signature. Either way the result was the same. They were coming. Not far. He checked Emily Carter. Still unconscious, breathing with more regularity, color continuing to improve. He moved the evidence drive and satellite communicator to the locked kitchen cabinet behind the cast iron cookware. Then he went to the window and stood beside Ghost. 2 dark-colored SUVs on the ridge road, 200 yards east. Lights off. Stopped. People who were lost in a storm left their lights on. People who were hunting in a storm turned them off. He estimated 4 to 6 occupants as a working assumption. Not police, no emergency lighting, no announcement of presence. Not search and rescue. They were exactly what Emily Carter had told him before consciousness slipped away from her again. The people who had betrayed her. Sent to make sure she didn't come off this mountain alive. He had approximately 15 minutes before they completed their approach on foot. He intended to use every one of them. He went out the back door into the storm with his night vision in place and Ghost at his heel. The cold wanted in through every gap and seam. Jack moved through it without acknowledgement. He had worked in worse. He had worked in the Hindu Kush in January with a torn shoulder and 31 hours without sleep, and he had done the job that needed doing. This was cold. Cold was manageable. He moved east along the cabin's face toward the timber, where the most logical approach from the ridge road would funnel movement. The paracord went between trees at ankle height at 2 points along that approach. Not to stop anyone, not even to slow them, but to make noise. He tied aluminum carabiners from the hardware bag at intervals along each line, chosen because they would clatter against each other when disturbed, and in the quiet between wind gusts that sound would carry 20 feet. An alarm, not a trap. He needed to know when they arrived before they knew he was ready. He moved north next, where the tree line came closest to the cabin, within 40 yards, the most dangerous approach vector because it offered concealment almost to the door. He set a secondary line at mid-thigh height between 3 large pines. Anyone moving fast through those trees at night would hit it. Anyone moving carefully might see it. Either way their movement would change, and changed movement was observable. He came back inside. Ghost resumed his position at the window without being told. Jack looked at the Malinois, still standing near the couch, watching Emily Carter with that half-exhausted, entirely present attention. "You stay here," Jack said. "You protect her." The Malinois looked at him for a moment. Then it walked, deliberately, to the couch and settled on the floor beside her with its head on its paws and its eyes on the door. The image of it, sutured, bandaged, running on something closer to will than strength, choosing its post without hesitation, landed on Jack in a way he didn't try to deflect. He picked up the night vision monocular and went to take his position. The first alarm triggered at 31 minutes, later than expected, which told him the approaching team was moving carefully. Professional behavior. These were not panicked criminals improvising in a storm. These were trained people executing a plan. He thought about them accordingly. Ghost heard the carabiners before Jack did, already at the window with his body rigid, his vocalization cut to almost nothing. A ghost of a sound. What a truly trained protection dog did in a crisis. Communicated without broadcasting. Through the monocular the night vision turned the world green and sharp. 4 figures moving through the eastern timber in a loose tactical formation that spoke to military or paramilitary training. White-gray winter camouflage. Long weapons, rifles. Moving with the patient, deliberate footfall of people who had done this before. 4 on the east side. He swept north and found 2 more figures approaching the secondary alarm line. 6 total. Possibly more at the vehicles. He filed that away. 4 minutes before they would reach the cabin's perimeter. He made his decision. He could hold the cabin defensively, the advantages of cover, concealment, warmth, a protected position for Emily Carter, offset by the certainty that 6 professionals would eventually encircle him and produce a situation where the mathematics were unsolvable. Or he could take the fight outward. Into the storm. Into terrain he knew better than anyone approaching from outside. Tactically audacious. Potentially decisive. And it meant leaving the cabin briefly, but the Malinois on that floor had already answered that concern. He went out the back door again and moved south along the property edge, circling wide, getting into the western timber before the approaching team reached the cabin's sight lines. The cold was inside his gloves now, but he managed it by acknowledging it as information and setting it aside. He found his position, A fallen log on a slight rise giving him sightlines to both the east approach and the north tree line, with a cabin visible to his right through the snowfall. He settled into the snow behind the log. Ghost settled beside him. They waited. The east alarm triggered again, louder, as the lead figure walked directly through the cord in the dark. Jack raised the monocular and watched the lead man signal the others, watched them adjust formation and slow further. They had heard the alarm. They knew now that someone had prepared for them. Good. That was exactly the information he wanted them to have. Fear, in his experience, was a more reliable tactical asset than surprise. Surprise ended the moment it happened. Fear lingered. It slowed decision-making. It introduced doubt into the spaces where confidence usually lived. He watched them come on. Slower. Tighter together, the opposite of what good training required, but fear had pushed them toward each other, the ancient animal instinct overriding the tactical mind. He noted this. The North team came through the secondary line 6 minutes later, the sound sharp and clear in a gap between gusts, and both figures dropped into the snow immediately, weapons up, searching. Professional reaction. But dropping meant stationary, and stationary meant predictable. Jack made a low sound, not a word, just a frequency Ghost had been trained to interpret. The dog shifted position without sound, moving 10 yards left, creating a second point of presence in the timber. Anyone watching the tree line now had 2 sources of potential threat rather than 1. He let the silence work. 3 minutes of nothing. The North team stayed prone, waiting for something that didn't come. The East team had stopped 20 yards from the cabin's perimeter, huddled in the timber, communicating in whispers or hand signals. Jack could see all of them through the monocular. None of them could see him. He was at the edge of the cabin's light fall, dark clothing against dark timber, storm doing the rest. He moved on the East team first. Not with the P-320. Not yet, not unless unavoidable, because a gunfight in these conditions with these numbers was last resort, not first option. He moved along the far side of the fallen log in a low crawl, keeping beneath the sight lines of the 4 figures, working through the snow with the practiced silence of a man who had done exactly this kind of movement in exactly this kind of darkness more times than he had counted. He got within 20 feet of the rearmost figure and stopped. He had the suppressed Ruger in his hands. What he did next was not a shot. It was a sound. He clicked the bolt back and let it ride forward, distinct, mechanical, absolutely unmistakable to anyone who had ever carried a weapon, and he placed that sound in the darkness behind the rearmost figure, close and deliberate, and then went silent again. The effect was immediate. The rearmost figure scrambled forward toward the others, breaking formation completely. The lead man's hand signals became sharp and urgent. They had someone behind them, or thought they did. The mathematics of their situation had just changed, and they knew it, and they didn't know how badly or in which direction. Jack was already moving. He circled back to Ghost, collected his dog, and moved north. The 2-man team on that side was on its feet again but hesitant, and hesitant people in the dark in a blizzard in terrain they don't know are people making mistakes. He came around behind the north timber at an angle that kept the wind in his face and found them exactly where the monocular had predicted, moving along the tree line toward the cabin's north face. Close enough now that he could hear them without equipment. One of them said something low to the other. Not English. Eastern European, he thought. He stepped out of the timber behind them and said, in a voice calibrated to carry exactly far enough and no further, "On your knees. Hands behind your head. Right now." A human voice, close and controlled and utterly without panic, in the dark behind you, in a storm, in terrain you came to control, it produces a very specific paralysis. Jack had seen it before. He saw it now. Both figures froze. One began to turn. "Don't," Jack said. One word carrying its own weight. The figure stopped. Weapons on the snow. Slowly. A long pause. Then Ghost materialized from the timber to Jack's left in that silent, flowing way he moved, placing himself between the 2 figures and the cabin, hackles raised, body low. The sight of a German shepherd appearing from the darkness of a blizzard had its own effect. Both weapons went into the snow. Jack secured them with zip ties from his jacket pocket. He carried them the same way he carried the jerky, because certain things are always useful, and left them with instructions that were simple and serious. Then he moved back toward the east side. The east team had fractured. The sound manipulation in the timber had broken their cohesion, and 2 of the 4 had already begun retreating toward the ridge road, moving fast and careless through the snow. The remaining 2 had taken positions against pines at the cabin's perimeter, watching the door with weapons raised. These 2 were harder. They had committed to the objective and had not broken despite the confusion, the storm, the sounds in the timber behind them. Jack respected this in the abstract way you respect professional discipline. He also understood that respect in this context was not a reason to hesitate. Ghost moved first, not at command but because the dog had read the situation the same way Jack had and reached the same conclusion, going left, low and fast through the snow, drawing the attention of both figures as Jack moved right. In the 3 seconds both men tracked the dog. Jack closed the distance and dealt with the nearer one in the clean, efficient way that 11 years of operational experience expressed itself when there was no room for anything else. The second man had time to turn. What followed was brief and physical, conducted entirely in the snow at the base of a pine tree, and when it was over Jack's left shoulder had a sharpness that would become a bruise the size of a dinner plate by morning. Both men were secured. Neither was seriously hurt. This was deliberate. He needed them functional enough for custody, and he needed whatever they knew accessible to the people who would come with questions. He retrieved Ghost. The dog had a small cut along his muzzle where the snow's crust had caught him in the fast movement. Jack checked it with bare fingers in the dark and found it superficial. Ghost shook his head once and looked at Jack with an expression combining irritation and professional satisfaction. "I know," Jack said. "You were right about the one on the left." The 2 who had retreated toward the vehicles hadn't made it. The storm and terrain had worked against them the way a mountain's indifference to human plans always eventually does. He found them sheltering against a rock formation 150 yards up the ridge road, nearly hypothermic. Their communication equipment failed in the cold. He secured them and, because they were genuinely at risk from the temperature, he brought them back to the cabin. Perhaps an odd decision from a purely tactical standpoint. But Jack Mercer had not gone to war to become something that left people to die in the cold. He had done hard things in his life and made peace with most of them. Leaving 2 men to freeze on a mountain 50 yards from a warm cabin was not something he was going to add to the list. He came through the front door with Ghost and stopped. Emily Carter was sitting upright on the couch. Pale, unsteady, clearly in significant pain, but conscious. Her eyes were clear. And the Malinois was standing beside the couch with its head at her hand, and she was stroking its ears with the automatic gentleness of someone who has reached for that particular comfort so many times it has become part of breathing. She looked at Jack. Then at the 2 secured men he was moving through the doorway. Then back at Jack. "How many?" she said. 6. "All secured." A silence. "You went out there. Alone." "Ghost was with me." Something moved across her face. Not quite a smile. Something more complicated and more genuine. She looked at the dog at her feet and then at Ghost standing at Jack's side, and the look on her face was the look of someone who has been given back something they had already decided they were going to lose. "His name is Titan," she said. Her voice still rough, scraped by cold and hours of unconsciousness. "He's been my partner for 2 years. She stopped. Looked at the bandaged flank. "He found you. He stood over you in the blizzard," Jack said. "For however long he had to. He didn't leave." Emily Carter looked at Titan for a long moment. The dog looked back at her with those dark, precise eyes, and its tail moved once. That slow, exhausted acknowledgement that meant exactly what it meant, no more and no less. She put her hand on the dog's head. "I know," she said softly. "I know you did." Jack made coffee because there was nothing in the world that a situation like this didn't call for. He handed Emily Carter a mug and sat across from her and waited. The fire burned. The secured men on the far side of the room were quiet in the way people become quiet when they understand the situation has definitively resolved against them. He let her come to the full story in her own time, and when she began to talk, he listened the way he had always listened to operational debriefs, completely, without interruption, assembling the picture from every piece she gave him. 16 months. That was how long she had been building the case. A criminal network embedded in the mountain regions of 3 states, using the remoteness and jurisdictional complexity of federal and state land to operate a logistics infrastructure for weapons trafficking, money movement for foreign actors, and data theft from government contractors. Sophisticated. Resourced at a level that suggested either significant criminal wealth or state-level backing, possibly both. Her counterintelligence team had been patient and careful and legal. Then someone inside gave them up. She didn't yet know who. She had suspicions, a name, a pattern of behavior over 3 months she'd been trying to confirm, but hadn't confirmed it before the operation went wrong. Her field team had been moving into position for a surveillance operation at one of the network's known mountain sites. 2 miles from the target location, the ambush happened. 2 of her team members were dead. She had taken the headwound when her vehicle was forced off the road. Titan had gotten her out. She didn't know how, because she was unconscious. But Titan had gotten her out and stood over her and waited. The evidence drive contained 3 months of encrypted operational data, communications intercepts, financial records, location data, everything needed to dismantle the network and identify the inside source. It was the reason they had tried to kill her. Not just to stop her getting off the mountain, but to recover that drive, because without it the network stayed intact and the source inside stayed hidden. Jack listened to all of it without expression. Then he was quiet for a moment. "The satellite communicator," he said. "You have a contact. Emergency contact at the DOJ. Bypasses the Bureau's internal chain completely." She met his eyes. "Because I don't know how high the inside access goes." Jack retrieved the communicator from the kitchen cabinet and brought it to her. She unlocked it and made the call. Short, the way people make calls when they've been in the field long enough to know brevity and clarity are the same thing. Location. Situation report. Personnel count. A single identifier code. Then she ended the call. 6 hours, she said. Maybe less if the storm cooperates. It won't, Jack said. But 6 hours is fine. He sat back down. The fire crackled. Ghost lay down between Jack's chair and Emily Carter's couch, the physical center of the room, equidistant from everything that needed protecting. Titan shifted on the floor and put his head in Emily's lap and closed his eyes with the absolute surrender of an animal that has finally, after everything, been given permission to rest. Jack watched this and felt something he didn't try to name or categorize. Some things are better held than labeled. "Thank you," Emily Carter said. Simple, direct, not performed. "You don't need to thank me," Jack said. "I know I don't need to. I want to." A pause. "You went out there with 1 dog and a suppressed .22 and stopped 6 armed professionals in a blizzard. Ghost helps." She looked at his dog. "He does." Another pause. "What did you do before you moved up here?" "Quiet work for the government," Jack said. She looked at him for a long moment with those sharp, clear eyes. "Yeah," she said. "I figured." They sat together while the storm completed itself, while the night moved through its long dark middle hours toward the thin gray promise of morning. At some point Jack told her about Ghost. Not about the years before, not in specific terms, but about the shape of the life he had been and the shape of the life he was building. Emily Carter listened with the same complete attention she had given to her own debrief, and the conversation had the quality that certain conversations in certain extraordinary circumstances can possess, of being entirely real in a way that most conversations manage only briefly and approximately. She told him about Titan. About the first training evaluation, where Titan had refused to perform a bite exercise on a handler who had been unnecessarily rough with another dog earlier in the day. Not because Titan couldn't do it, but because he had decided not to, a distinction that the trainers argued about for weeks and that Emily had understood immediately. She had requested him specifically because of that incident. Because she wanted a partner who made decisions, not just followed instructions. Jack thought about that and found it exactly right. The morning came the way mornings come after long nights. Not dramatically, but with the quiet insistence of light, finding every crack in the darkness and simply filling it. The storm had reduced itself to a steady moderate snowfall without the wind, the kind that looked beautiful from inside a warm room. Jack stood at the window with his coffee and watched the light come up over the peaks and thought nothing specific, just inhabited the moment with the fullness he had learned since coming to the mountains. Ghost came and stood beside him. The dog leaned against his leg, not seeking anything, just making contact. Jack put his hand on the dog's head. "Good night's work," Jack said quietly. Ghost said nothing, because Ghost was a dog, but the lean against his leg was an answer of a kind. The helicopters came at 7:43 in the morning. Two of them. One medical, one tactical. Rotors audible several minutes before they appeared through the snowfall, descending into the clearing beyond the barn with the precise confidence of pilots who had done exactly this kind of mountain extraction in exactly this kind of weather. Federal agents in tactical gear came off the tactical bird fast and professional. Jack met them at the front door and gave a complete situation report in under 4 minutes, and they listened with the focused attention of people who had been thoroughly briefed on what they were arriving into. The medical team assessed Emily Carter with efficient care. Hypothermia resolving, concussion, bruising, no fractures. Hospital time required, but stable and coherent. Going to be fine. A veterinary medic came off the tactical bird, a detail Jack noticed and found quietly significant, that someone had thought to include that person in the response package. The medic examined Titan's wound and inspected the suture work and looked up at Jack. "This is clean work," the vet said. "He held still," Jack said. The vet looked at the dog. "Yeah," she said softly. "He would." They loaded Emily Carter and Titan onto the medical helicopter. Before they lifted, while she sat in the cargo bay doorway with a thermal blanket around her shoulders and the morning light crossing the snow, she looked at Jack standing in the clearing beside his cabin. "The inside contact," she said. "The evidence drive will tell us who." "I know. When it does, the network they were running up here. It was bigger than what I told you. Your property is adjacent to land they were using." She looked at the timber surrounding his cabin on 3 sides. "You might get some federal visitors in the coming weeks. They know where to find me." She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at Ghost, sitting in the snow at Jack's side with his ears forward, watching the helicopter with the uncomplicated attention of a dog who finds the most interesting thing in any scene and simply observes it. "Take care of him," she said. "He takes care of me," Jack said. The helicopter lifted. He stood in the clearing and watched it rise through the snowfall until it was a sound rather than a shape, and then until it was neither. Just the morning settling back into itself, the peaks and the timber and the snow-covered ground, and the silence that wasn't silence at all but the voice of a place that had been there long before any of them and would be there long after. Ghost sat beside him. Jack put his hand on the dog's head and stood there for a while. The weeks that followed were busy in a way the mountains hadn't been since he'd arrived. Federal agents came and went, courteous, professional, thorough, mapping the adjacent land, asking questions Jack answered completely, departing through his gate which they always closed behind them. That detail told him something about who they were. The inside contact was identified within 10 days of the evidence drive being processed. Jack didn't learn the name. That information moved through channels he was no longer connected to, but he learned the outcome. The network dismantled. Its operations across 3 states shut down. The foreign connections severed and passed to the appropriate agencies. The kind of outcome that doesn't produce press conferences or public acknowledgement. That lives in the quiet record of cases closed and threats neutralized. Where most of the important work actually lives. Emily Carter spent 11 days in the hospital, 7 fewer than the initial estimate, because she was not the kind of patient who healed in an orderly fashion. She was discharged on a Thursday in early February and spent 2 weeks at her sister's house before anyone official was allowed near her, and on the 15th day she drove herself back to work because she had never done anything at someone else's pace when she could do it at her own. Titan recovered with the same stubborn efficiency. On a morning in the last week of February, when the winter had begun its first tentative loosening and the light had changed just enough to suggest the season knew something the calendar hadn't admitted yet, Jack heard a vehicle coming up his driveway. He was on the porch with his coffee when the car came into view. A dark SUV, federal plates. It stopped in the cleared area in front of the cabin and Emily Carter stepped out. She looked well. She moved with the same purposeful economy he had seen in her, even when she was barely conscious on his couch, and there was color in her face that the blizzard had taken and the hospital had returned. She was in civilian clothes, jeans, heavy canvas jacket, boots that understood the terrain. Then the back door opened and Titan stepped out. The dog moved carefully, still protecting the repaired flank with a slight adjustment of gait the vet had said would resolve over another month or two. But he moved with the same purposeful quality Jack remembered from the blizzard, three-legged and bleeding and absolutely not stopping. Ghost came down off the porch. The two dogs met in the snow in the cleared area in front of the cabin, and the meeting had none of the elaborate negotiation that dogs sometimes perform with strangers. No circling. No bristling. No careful display of relative standing. They simply came together, nose to nose, and stood there for a moment in the way that animals sometimes stand when they are recognizing rather than introducing. Then Ghost's tail moved and Titan's tail moved, and they moved apart and turned to stand side by side, facing outward, looking at the tree line and the peaks and the long white expanse of the mountain morning. Two warriors. Standing together. Looking at the same horizon. Jack came down off the porch. Emily Carter was standing beside the SUV with her hands in the pockets of her canvas jacket, watching the two dogs with the expression he had seen on her face in the cabin in the small hours, beyond gratitude, beyond relief, in the deeper country of things that change you permanently. His name is Titan, she said, though Jack already knew it. He saved my life. He was still saving it when I found him, Jack said. Hadn't stopped. She looked at the dogs standing together in the snow. I wanted to bring him back here, so he could see where it happened. A pause. And because I thought you should know his name. Formally. Titan, Jack said. The dog's ears moved at the sound. Jack crouched down in the snow, and the dog came to him directly, without hesitation, and Jack put his hand on the dog's neck and felt the warmth of the animal and the particular aliveness that working dogs carry, that quality of being entirely present in the moment they are in, not carrying the last one or reaching toward the next. He stayed there for a moment. Then he straightened. Ghost had returned to the porch and was watching from there with his amber eyes and his ghost-gray muzzle and his eternal, uncomplicated assessment of the world. Come inside, Jack said to Emily Carter. Coffee's on. She came inside. And the storm that had come without warning, that had buried a mountain road and silenced a valley, and brought 4 lives together in the crucible of a blizzard night on a remote mountain, existed now the way the most important things exist. Not only in headlines or case files, though it lived there too in the stripped-down vocabulary of outcomes and actions taken. It existed in the memory of the people who had been inside it. In the bond between a man and his dog, and a woman and her dog, and the way those bonds had crossed and held against the weight of everything that had tried to break them. It existed in the space between 2 dogs standing side by side in the snow on a late winter morning, looking out at the same mountains with the same steady, patient attention. Ghost and Titan. 2 warriors. 2 loyal protectors. The storm that had almost taken everything had instead given something that none of them had thought to ask for. It had given them each other. And sometimes that is the only ending that is true.